Thank you very much, LO, and let's move on to the case of the Prime Minister.
Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not a question of whether we should abridge individual languages and totally oppress them from practicing their own languages. We think that this debate is a question of how do you balance individual languages and the communities which practice these particular languages, and at the same time address the problem of diversity that we have right now. Because we think that while diversity is good, Mr. Chair, in their results, it also makes certain communities individualistic in terms of how they approach, for example, national issues, Mr. Chair, and their results. And we think that this kind of problem is particularly important and something that opening opposition never responded to. At best, we think that opening opposition's case is actually conceivable, Mr. Chair, and their results. That we should allow for individual communities, that we should give them spaces for their languages to grow. But at worst, we think that they do nothing to actually cure the individualistic mindset that we have right now. Because what is opening opposition's counter proposal, or at the very least their counter standards? They say that, status quo is actually enough in trying to empower individual languages by teaching these languages in educational institutions, by allowing individual communities to actually practice them. Number one, this is already status quo, Mr. Chair, and their results. And we could see that coming from opening government, this is not mutually exclusive because individuals on the ground can go as far as practicing their own language, even teach it within their own communities, but not at the same time forget that they have a greater social responsibility to address the social cohesion of a particular nation, Mr. Chair, and their results. But secondly, we think that even if there is individual empowerment, Mr. Chair, in their results, we think number one, they're unresponsive, but more importantly, if you look at it, at best, their paradigm only introduces individualism, Mr. Chair. In this case, you allow communities to morph on their own without necessarily, for example, turning your attention to other communities which might be morphing on their own. Also, you could see that naturally language will morph on its own. But the question is, how do you control the morph to meet, for example, national standards, Mr. Chair? And yes, we're going to go as far as willing to defend standardization because we think that that is also important in this debate. Secondly, they tell us that the language reflects the cultures of these individuals, and thus, like culture, it must also be dynamic. We think this is exactly why we recognize in opening government, Mr. Chair, that the Filipino language is not just, for example, made up of the Tagalog language, but rather it's a fusion of the certain languages of the Cebuanos, for example, and the Davaoense language. We think that this kind of declaration is particularly important in trying to demonstrate, Mr. Chair, in Nervous House, how the government of the Philippines necessarily wants to be inclusive in how it necessarily arbitrates all the languages of the Philippine community, Mr. Chair, and Nervous House. We concede that it might not be perfect as a model, but we think that in theory, at the very least, there is an attempt to bridge the gaps between these particular individual communities. And we think that that's betterment in our paradigm versus allowing the language to naturally evolve on its own, Mr. Chair, and results. But furthermore, we think that in their paradigm, there's no way for them to cure the hegemony, Mr. Chair, and results. Because if you look at it, without the declaration of, say, the Filipino language, the Tagalog language, Mr. Chair, would have been winning right now. Because number one, the state is present in the national capital region, and therefore, the individuals here feel as though their language is superior. Without our paradigm, Mr. Chair, providing direction and providing cohesion, these kinds of mindsets continually perpetuate within individuals, Mr. Chair, and their results. And we think this is unfair, considering that we concede that languages tie back to the identity of these individuals, and no individual deserves to feel as though his language is second best or that his language is second rate. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, I want to talk about how the arbitration of languages is in line with the end goal of unifying diversity. But secondly, I also want to talk about, just to address opening opposition and the POI of closing opposition, about balancing priorities in this case, Mr. Chair, and their results. Because we tell you on first argument that diversity is something that is naturally present in society, and conceivably, some languages may be self-correcting, and that some languages might die, like for example the Latin languages, and some language might actually flourish depending on the community that uses system. But the directionlessness and the randomization of evolution, Mr. Chair, becomes exclusive only to the majority. This is why, for example, you have the majority, or Luzon, for example, having its continued mindset that it's the superior language, Mr. Chair, and Member South. We think that this problem necessarily is not answered in their paradigm. This is present in the opposition's model, yet they do nothing to actually cure it. They just say, let's continually empower individual languages. But we think, Mr. Chair, that the value of arbitration is to be inclusive more than exclusive, Mr. Chair, which is a direct comparison to the value that opening opposition is trying to perpetuate. But even if in circumstances where we have to set the standard, we're willing to do this because it's only through the imposition of the standard that you recognize, Mr. Chair and Members House, that despite the individuality of these individuals, there needs to be a standard where you all have to meet, for example, as a nation. Because as a nation, Mr. Chair and Members House, the reason why we have a national language in the first place isn't just for you to be able to communicate with each other no matter where you come from, whether it be from Sulu or in Zamanis or somewhere, Mr. Chair and Members House, but rather it's also about your identity and unifying your identity regardless of its being diverse. But secondly, I want to talk about the argument of balancing priorities. Because in this debate, we also recognize that there are two things that have to be abridged right now. Number one, you have individual communities of languages, and yes, we concede that they have their rights to access these individual languages, Mr. Chair, and practice it. But secondly, you also have the national initiative to necessarily arbitrate between all six. The first question we have to ask is which paradigm necessarily which necessarily supersedes one over the other. Well, we recognize that individual rights must be catered to. We're not saying we should automatically, abolish their right to do this, because on the ground, we're still allowing them to practice their individual languages. But secondly, we think it's important that the state be given the responsibility to determine how it's going to abridge all the differences between these individual communities. We're not saying that all of you should be alike, but we're saying that there must be a common point where at the very least, all of you can be recognized as, for example, a nation or as belonging to a particular community, Mr. Chair and Member House. This answers the problem of greater social cohesion, which is necessarily mutually exclusive only to opening government. We fear coming from opening opposition that at best case scenario, what you're going to do is fine. You're going to empower individuals, Mr. Chair and Member House. But at the end of the day, this does nothing to bridge the already gaping holes between, for example, Mindanao, Visayas, and Luzon. If you look at Philippines, Mr. Chair and Member House. And with that, we're proud to host. Thank you.